Hi, and welcome to Eagle Theater's presentation of Lincoln, which I think you're going to find is probably the best movie of 2012. And remember where you heard it first. Daniel Day-Lewis's performance as Lincoln is going to win the Oscar for Best Actor of the Year. My name is Eric Gubelman, and I'm the president of Eagle Theater Corporation. By an odd coincidence, I'm also a PhD student at the University of Tennessee. My field of interest is 19th century American history, and my research interest is race, particularly antebellum racist attitudes in the Midwest. And tonight, instead of previews before this film, this is a brief talk about the historical context of the movie you're about to see. Now, if you're rolling your eyes right now, it might be a good time to head to the concession stand. I've heard the popcorn here is pretty good. And if you have your cell phone on, turn it off and put it away before the movie starts. Got it? Okay, thanks. And thank you for your patience in waiting to see this movie. We know you have a choice, and getting this movie has been a frustrating odyssey. We appreciate your support. And remember the Eagle Theater motto, friends don't let friends watch DVDs. Though the title of the movie is Lincoln, the movie is about three things really. It's about emancipation, it's about the emancipator, and it's about race. It's great cinema, but it's also pretty good history, although it's limited in scope to a few weeks in December of 1864. We're not going to spend too much time tonight talking about how the movie differs from history's exact sequence. And if you want to find more about that, Google it, because there are some things that historians have taken issue with. But instead of concentrating on that, what I want to do tonight is to put this in some historical context. In December of 1864, Lincoln was trying to jam the 13th Amendment down the throat of a lame duck Congress that had, at the time, a substantial Democratic minority that didn't much want to amend the Constitution to finally, and for all time, end the practice of chattel slavery in the United States. And if you want to know more about Lincoln and his role in emancipation, I would suggest a book by Eric Foner called The Fiery Trial. It's the best of about a half dozen recent works about Lincoln. What you have to understand is the origin of the Civil War was firmly rooted in the South's desire to protect its peculiar institution of slavery and their fear that the election of a Republican president in 1860 marked the beginning of the end for slavery. If someone tells you that the Civil War was fundamentally about states' rights, they probably haven't read much history, or more likely, they're trying to make history fit a current political agenda. The South had reached a decision that they could not stay in the Union that had a political party in charge that opposed the expansion of slavery. The Confederacy fought to establish an independent slaveholding republic, and the North originally went to war to put down that rebellion. But it was not an original war aim to end slavery. Indeed, there were several states in the North that stayed within the Union, including Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri, and each of these states allowed slavery. We can also include West Virginia as a border state, which broke away from Virginia when Virginia joined the Confederacy. From the war's beginning then, the politics of the North included placating the border state slaveholders who favored remaining within the Union, but who also favored slavery. And it would also be a mistake to assume the North was unanimously opposed to slavery. The Democratic Party, for instance, at its most liberal, was indifferent to slavery. And the common ground in the Republican Party was not opposition to slavery, but opposition to the expansion of slavery, something very different. At the outbreak of the war, then, only a tiny minority of abolitionists in the North favored an immediate and uncompensated end to chattel slavery. Nevertheless, the friction of war abraded the institution of slavery. Slaves in the Confederacy who were close to the fighting would self-emancipate by fleeing to Union lines, raising the military question of what to do with them. Should you return this contraband to slaveholders where it could be used to further the war? Well, Congress weighed in on this question twice in the Confiscation Acts of 1861 and 1862, which authorized the seizure of slaves as contraband. The abolition of slavery then could be understood as a cudgel that the North could use to weaken the Confederacy. And Lincoln's approach differed from the congressional approach and could be described as first as being much more conservative, but arguably on firmer constitutional ground. What Lincoln argued for in 1861 and 1862 was graduated, compensated emancipation. And he tried, without success, to get the border state legislatures interested in the idea. His reasoning was that if border states ended slavery, the Confederacy would collapse. But the border states did not act in 1862, and they couldn't. Their attachment to slavery was just as strong as their attachment to Union. But within this context, in 1861 and 1862, and as a wartime measure, Lincoln went beyond his earlier conservatism, went beyond what Congress had authorized, and stepped out boldly just over 150 years ago, proclaiming the freedom of the slaves on January 1st, 1863. Not freedom for all slaves, but most slaves, but not all, of the areas rebelling. But he left slavery untouched in some of those areas and in all of the border states. And so here we are at the beginning of the film in December of 1864. Military victory for the North is all but assured, and the Emancipation Proclamation's promise of 1863 of freedom for slavery was being redeemed on the military battlefield. However, it was a legal and constitutional mess. The slaves in most of the Confederacy were being freed by presidential proclamation that was backed by military might, while loyal slaveholders in Maryland, Kentucky, Delaware, and Missouri still retained slavery. In addition, and this is very important, Lincoln was unsure whether his proclamation would stand up in court after the war. And he also doubted whether Congress even had the power to end slavery. The only option to once and for all settle the status of slavery was to amend the Constitution. And the movie Lincoln is about Lincoln's race to get that accomplished before his wartime powers evaporated in the Union victory. The movie is a political thriller, and it does take a little bit of license with compressing a few details and probably overstating the emphasis and the time constraints that Lincoln was under. But it is a wonderful movie. And while this is the historical context of the battle to end slavery, the movie is also about race and how 19th century Americans viewed race. Now let me take you on a thought experiment to illustrate how differently we think about race in the 21st century and how different that is from our American cousins who preceded us. Okay, in 2013, if you believe that blacks should be enslaved, whether because they're considered property or whether because they're inferior and better off as slaves, then we would rightly consider you to be a racist. In 2013, if you believe that blacks should not be allowed to be married or to testify in court or to enter into contracts, we would rightly consider you to be a racist. In 2013, if you believe that blacks should not be allowed to vote, then we would rightly consider you to be a racist. And today, in 2013, if you believe that blacks and whites should be legally prohibited from intermarrying, then we would rightly consider you to be a racist. To the 21st century ear, I just rattled off 4 examples of racism. But to the 19th century ear, I just described 4 very different categories of rights that reasonable people could arrive at very different conclusions. For example, many in the North believed slavery to be a moral wrong, contrary to universal rights, but many held that while slavery was regrettable, it was central to the economy of the nation. It could not be ended swiftly. And in any event, the federal government lacked the constitutional authority to end it. It would have to come from the states. Many believed that blacks were excluded from universal rights as enumerated in the Declaration of Independence, and they were excluded because they weren't really people, they were merely property. Those who believed that slavery was wrong tended to favor some limited civil rights for blacks. But the idea that blacks were equal under the law was seen by many to be preposterous. How could a court take the word of a black testifying against a white man? Political rights were even more out of reach. Even in the North, most states did not allow free blacks to vote. And the idea of social rights, that blacks and whites could intermarry, was almost totally out of bounds. Although many an interracial child was born of the union of a slaveholding master and a slave mother. 19th century America was awash in racial thinking. And historians who write about Lincoln have trouble putting themselves in that mindset. And the result is a sort of a binary history that either views Lincoln as an unredeemable racist who did the bare minimum required, or a saintly Lincoln who was a master politician who did what he had to do to move the public opinion along at the right time. As a historian, I think the truth about Lincoln and emancipation, the end of chattel slavery, shades a little towards Lincoln being a skilled politician, although you don't have to view him as a saint to give him his due. Lincoln was a great emancipator, but he wasn't the only emancipator. He was pushed along by slaves who took matters into their own hands, and he was pushed along by radical Republicans in the Congress who held him morally accountable. But it was Lincoln who made it work. The Emancipation Proclamation may have been viewed by contemporary historians, at least some of them, as being too little and too late, but you know it worked. And there are others whose face is carved on Mount Rushmore for less accomplishment than that. This is the Lincoln that you're going to see in the film. Now, when it comes to judging Lincoln on the question of racial equality, the evidence is mixed if you're looking at it from a 21st century perspective. But you really need to get into the 19th century perspective. There's a scene in the film with Mary Todd Lincoln's black dressmaker, Mrs. Keckley, who asked Lincoln a few direct questions about his racial attitudes. Listen for that scene and note the ambiguity of Lincoln's answer. The movie explores America's complicated racial attitudes largely through the congressional debate. You know, in 21st century terms, 19th century Illinois was one of the most racist states of the North. In southern Illinois, there was considerable unrest following the Emancipation Proclamation. And in 1862, 95% of the voters from a line south of Springfield on the west and Paris on the east voted to bar free blacks from living in the state. Lincoln was part of this culture. He was part of this milieu, and in some ways he rose above it, and in other ways he didn't. By late 1862, he favored both freeing the slaves, but he also favored voluntary colonization abroad after the war so that blacks could not live among whites. If you look at that from the best case, this was a paternalistic attempt to separate the races for their own good. If you look at it from its worst case, this is an example of overt bigotry. On issues of racial equality, Lincoln was a work in progress, and by late 1864, he had suggested a gentle suggestion to the wartime Louisiana governor that perhaps some black soldiers after the war should be allowed to vote. A work in progress. Watch in the movie for this wonderful scene invented out of whole cloth, but conveying an essential truth of a couple from Missouri who went to see the president. And they favored the 13th Amendment to end slavery as a wartime measure. But they allowed that if the war were to end before the amendment passed, they would just as soon see slavery retained, because they didn't want competition from free blacks for jobs in their community. And what this movie does not show is the tragic consequence of settling the slavery question, but not successfully navigating the question of the place of freedmen in post-war America. Reconstruction after the war is a sad tale of an American failure. It is little and badly taught in our schools, and you're not going to get a whiff of it in the movie. This movie instead is is a celebratory film about a moment we all should celebrate: the passage of the 13th Amendment out of the House of Representatives. I guess in conclusion I would say this is a wonderful movie and it's good history, but if you like it and you want to know more about it, go read a book. Go read a couple books, because it's close. It's not gospel, but it's going to give you the essence. If you want a different way of looking at it, from the movie, Tommy Lee Jones plays the Republican House Leader Thaddeus Stevens. He's a radical Republican. And Stevens, played by Jones, offered up a description of what you're about to see from a cinema perspective. Summarized Stevens: the greatest measure of the 19th century was passed by corruption, aided and abetted by the purest man in America. Enjoy this film. If you like it, tell your friends and post about it on Facebook. If you have questions, go to our Facebook page and post them there. But for now, just sit back, relax, and enjoy a wonderful movie. Thanks for coming.